Hello, and thank you so much for dropping by this video. This is going to be a short chat in response to a question I got online. I write on Quora, and sometimes people send me questions. And so this is a really interesting one. Someone had a problem with alcohol, a more severe problem with hash, and they were able to stop those, but now they're not able to stop using cigarettes. And they wanted to know what to do. So, first of all, that's awesome that you were able to stop drinking and stop abusing hashish. And one thing to understand is that people can have multiple addictions, and sometimes they'll stop one addiction and then they'll pick up another one, or another bad habit will then morph into an addiction. So again, I know very little. This person just sent me a short message. Well, so that's one thing to be mindful of. Now, the next thing to be mindful of is that cigarettes, nicotine is chemically addictive. And so, to get off of it, you may need medical help. There's different medical things to help people get off the nicotine, which is actually highly addictive on a chemical level. So you can try that and see if that works. Now, here's where things get really interesting, is if it's more than just a chemical addiction, if it's an addiction of, that has a spiritual root and then shows up as a mind-body addiction. And here I'm not talking about the chemical addiction at all. So I'll explain what I mean in a moment. Then you may need something more than just, like there's gum even. I think it's called Nicorest or something like that. But if it's not just a chemical addiction, but if it's the kind of addiction I'm talking about, a real or chronic addiction, you may very well need spiritual help. And here's how to find out: is use something like Nicorest or any of the other medicines they have to help you get off nicotine. And if you're able to get off and you're done, boom, you're good. The same principle applies for something like heroin or any kind of chemical addiction. If you're able to go to rehab and go through the detox process and get off the chemical addiction, and then you go and you're fine, then you're good. You're good to go. However, that doesn't work for everyone. I can't say many, a certain number of people will go through that process. They'll get off the nicotine, they'll get off the drug or off drinking, so that their body is no longer chemically addicted. However, they still have it's hard to put in the language. I call it a spiritual affliction that requires deeper help. And here's what it looks like. Let's take the example of, we'll just with the example of the person who asked. So let's say you go through, you get the special gum, you get the medicine to help you get off the nicotine, but then one day you don't think about it and you start smoking again, and next thing you know, you're off smoking just as bad as before. And then you're like, wait, I need to stop this. And then although there's some resistance, you go get the gum again, or you go get the medicine again, and you get off it. You're like, oh, thank God I'm off it. And then a couple weeks, a couple months, you pick up a cigarette. You don't even think about it. You pick up a cigarette, and next thing you know, you're off again. Now, if that is the case, whether it be cigarettes or alcohol or drugs, you may have a more severe addiction. And I'm not talking about the chemical dependency that happens with something like nicotine. So what I'm drawing on is the work from the very early part of the Alcoholics Anonymous movement, which is very different than sort of the modern version. But what they recognized is that there's really, when it comes to a problematic behavior, there's really three kinds of people. There's someone who's a moderate drinker who they can pretty much control it. And if it gets out of hand, they can just say, okay, I'm done. And they're done. No problem. Then there's what they call a heavy drinker. And this applies to any addiction. Now, a heavy drinker definitely is drinking too much. They find it bothersome and hard to cut back or reduce. However, if there's sufficient reason, for example, they're threatened by the loss of a job, or they're threatened by, there's the threat of losing their family, or a doctor says, hey, if you don't knock it off, you're going to die. This type of person can moderate, but it's hard. They may not be able to quit altogether, but using their willpower, they can cut back. So just to backtrack, a moderate drinker is someone who very easily can stop. A moderate addict can just stop. A heavy addict or heavy drinker, it takes a lot of willpower and a very strong reason. And they can do it, but it's hard. And then there's the real alcoholic addict, chronic alcoholic addict, the kind of person who I just described. They go to rehab, they get clean, they're like, okay, I'm never going to do it again. And a day, a week, a month later, they use, and when they use, they go off on a spree. It's like they lose control. Now, what differentiates the chronic or the real addict from the other kinds of addicts is that loss of job, loss of family, or even loss of life is not sufficient. They've lost their willpower. Now, this is very hard to understand because it doesn't seem logical. And so the metaphor that's been used to describe this, and it may not be a metaphor, it may be an actual reality, is of an allergy. Someone of this type of addiction, when they use once, whether it be a cigarette or a drink or pornography, they don't just use once. They have literally an abnormal reaction, and they're often running on a spree. And again, willpower is not sufficient. The possibility of a major life loss, whether it be losing your life, your job, family, is not sufficient to keep such a person from the addictive behavior. Now, that kind of person has a deep spiritual sickness that only a spiritual solution can help. And that spiritual solution is beautifully outlined in the first 164 pages of a book called Alcoholics Anonymous, that is really the foundation for every other 12-step movement out there. Sadly, what's happened is people, even in Alcoholics Anonymous, have really gotten away from the spiritual message, and really gotten away from clearly understanding the different levels of addiction: moderate, hard, and chronic or real. Now, if you're in the moderate or the hard, you don't need a spiritual solution. You still have willpower. But once you get to the level of chronic or real, you literally have a kind of insanity that willpower, logic, reasoning, a doctor pleading with you, a husband or wife threatening to leave you, it's not sufficient to stop you. It's sufficient to stop for a day or a week, maybe a month, though that's stretching it. But someone who's got themselves into that level of addiction really needs a higher power, really needs, in the truest sense of the word, a miracle. And those miracles happen every day, and I'm one of them, where through following a very simple, universal spiritual program and process, the compulsion literally gets lifted where willpower and threats failed. So thank you so much for dropping by this video. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them below. And hello to my one live viewer. I hope you got a lot out of this, and take care and have a beautiful day.